the steps in conducting survey research, and we talked about the purpose and objectives, target populations and samples, and designing the survey. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about writing a cover letter, administering the survey, and follow up to surveys that have already been administered. And in Module 4, we'll be talking about input of survey data, analyzing data, and communicating findings. So the objectives for this presentation are to describe the parts to be included in a cover letter for a survey, to understand how to administer surveys, and there's several ways that surveys can be administered, and finally to describe the follow-up strategies that can be used to increase return rates, because we want information from as many people as possible. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is cover letters and permission. And you've already talked about seeking permission in the earlier module, and as you know, permission is different depending on whether your respondents are adults or children. And remember, for children under the age of 18, we need a parental permission or a guardian's permission. And the cover letter is actually the vehicle for soliciting input. So cover letters are really important. You want to make them friendly and elicit a response, but you really don't want to make them too long because nobody reads that much stuff. So the first thing you want to do is have a personalized address. Make sure you say, "Dear Mrs. Smith" or "Dear Mr. Gonzalez." Then make sure that you say what the purpose of the study or the survey is. Many of you have probably been involved in parent surveys that you've been sent from your districts or your schools. So the purpose of this survey is to get some feedback on you on whether you think our school is serving your students' needs, your child's needs. And you usually want to put in a sentence or so about how important the study is, why it's important for the respondent to answer this survey. We need your input. Parents are important. We want to be responsive. Also a little bit about why the responder is important. It's very important. If we don't have parental input, we really won't know which direction you think we should take student learning. Then there's also some, after you've done the eliciting and you try and bring the reader in to see how important the study is and why you value their response, there's some nitty-gritty information. First of all, you want to set a time limit. Please return this survey by October 30th, or please return it in the next 3 weeks, or give a definite time limit. Make sure you say what the return process is, either put it in the enclosed envelope or give it to your child to turn into your teacher, or something about how this information is going to be returned needs to be expressed. You want to say that for the information that they give is confidential, and that they will not be identified, and the information will only be reported as group information that's been put together from everybody. You'll have an informed consent portion where they sign a part of the letter, which is something that's going to be returned. In some cases, you might want to offer the results for letters that are sent about parent surveys about schools. Usually the results are presented. If it's other results, you may or may not want to offer the results. One thing about offering the results is you will have to have some way to identify who wants them. So you'll have to ask for that information. Last, make sure you say thank you and try and get the signature of a high status person. For example, if the letter comes from the school, it seems as though the principal might be the best person to elicit information. Okay, there's several ways to administer survey. First of all, if you're doing a survey, you should do a pilot, and we'll talk about each one of these in a little bit. There are face-to-face paper and pencil surveys. There are mailed surveys, there are electronic surveys. Some people will consider interviews as surveys. In this class, we're going to talk about interviews separately, but in case you're doing some reading, sometimes you'll see interviews included as a survey type, and sometimes they're included simply as qualitative information. And before we start talking about these specific kinds of ways to administer surveys, it's important that we talk about identifiers. Now, identifiers are some manner of collecting data so we can track what's input, so we know who filled out a particular survey. Now, on some surveys, we don't need any tracking information. We might have a parent-teacher night and we ask people to fill out a survey, they fill it out, they turn it in then, and we don't really want to track who filled what in. And so that's easy, we don't really need an identifier. But for surveys where you're going to do a follow-up, or you might have a pre-post, or you might want to match a parent survey to child's achievement scores or something like that, you're going to need some kind of identifiers. Now, if you have an identifier, you need to tell people that you're asking this information. A lot of times on surveys from students, a student ID number is used. In the past, I used to use mother's maiden names, but it turns out that people don't know what their mother's maiden names are anymore. So I've started to use cell phone numbers, which is a really good way to match pre and post. Sometimes you'll see surveys where they'll just have little random numbers kind of in the corner of something that's supposed to be mailed in, and those are usually identifier numbers. If you're doing an email survey, you will have an identifier because you will obviously have the email that it came from. Okay. Whenever you're doing a survey, I really highly suggest doing a pilot. And a pilot is simply where you have a small number of people, it might be a couple teachers in your school or some parents, or just a small number of people that you're going to administer the survey to, and you're going to ask them what they thought about it. So what you want to find out is whether the people who took the survey, when they read the question, if they perceived the meaning that you intended. So you want to find out whether you're actually getting the information that you want. So you're going to have some kind of identifier for this small sample so you can get some information. When you get the feedback, it tends to be, a lot of times you'll just have a small focus group, or you'll just get together and talk to people, what did they think? Were there any questions that were confusing? Was there anything they were uncertain about? And it's kind of surprising when you're doing a survey how easy it is not to have the same meaning. I once surveyed on a project I was working for, we surveyed BITSA teachers, first and second year teachers who were going through their BITSA program. And we asked the question, how many years have you been teaching? And we thought that was just a very simple question, and people said, well, if this is my first year but I haven't finished, is that a 1 or is that a 0, or do I count my student teaching? And they had so many different ways of counting feedback. If I taught in Sunday school, does that count as my teaching? So we had to go back. Once you get this information that a question's not clear, then you have to go back to your survey and edit it, and given the feedback, reword the question in some way that you'll feel more confident that it will be understandable. The first real kind of survey, not counting pilot surveys, is the face-to-face paper and pencil surveys. And here you have to consider the setting where the survey is administered. Are you giving a survey to teachers in your school? Are you surveying parents at parent-teacher night, or your students in your classroom? So whatever the setting is, you want to make sure that it's comfortable and that whoever is completing the survey will be able to do it in that setting. You also want to make sure that you give very clear instructions. You don't need to put your name on here. When you're done, put it in the envelope and someone will collect them, or whatever your instructions happen to be. Make sure that you get permission. We've already talked about that. When you distribute the surveys, make sure everyone has one. And when you collect the surveys, usually what I do, I'll pass around an envelope if I'm around people face to face, so that they can put the survey in themselves, so that they won't think that I'm looking at their responses. A lot of times people feel nervous and self-conscious, and they really don't. They like the anonymity. They really don't want people to know how they're responding. The next kind of surveys is mailed surveys, and mailed surveys used to be used rather extensively, but now we see that there's really a diminishing use of mailed surveys. We see a lot more use of emailed surveys, but still, mailed surveys will reach certain parts of the population that don't have electronic access. And what this requires is correct address information, and that can be a little tricky to get, especially if you have a highly mobile population. The other thing about mail surveys that's somewhat prohibitive, it's very expensive. You have the cost of the paper or the letterhead, the envelopes, the postage. If you send if you want a return response, there's a lot of research that shows if you give a stamped envelope, you'll get a much higher return rate. And so there's a considerable amount of cost. If you consider just postage to and from and a little bit for paper, it's about $1 per survey. So it can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. Now, in terms of follow-up, you need to have an identifier to do the follow-up unless you want to send the survey out again to everyone, which may be annoying to some people. It may be you're paying to resend it to people who've already returned it. One way people do this is they'll send a postcard and say, we want to remind you to complete your survey. Sometimes people will even send postcards ahead of time. We just want to let you know that this survey is going to be coming in the mail soon. Second mailings can be effective in getting another round of returns. The other thing that can be done is phone calls. And phone calls can be highly effective ways of getting people to respond. I once talked to a researcher who was researching medical schools, and he was interested in finding out what happened to the people who were people that they didn't think were doing too well in medical school, and they wanted to drop out of the program. And he wanted to make sure he had every medical school in the country, and he spent a lot of time on the phone doing follow-up phone calls. Also, one thing that you can think about is if you're sending letters home to parents via students, you want to be sure that these letters are clear. You want to make sure that the students understand. You want to make sure that the instructions are very clear so that you do actually get the feedback. Electronic surveys are the wave of the future, and we're seeing more and more electronic surveys. But there are a couple things that are involved here. First of all, you have to have access to someone's email address, and this can be difficult as people change their email addresses at times. It's actually very easy and very low cost to send out electronic surveys. There are accuracy issues, though, depending upon the email addresses. You still need to have permission. There's two ways that surveys are sent out. One is if you email an attachment and then you ask people to indicate responses on attachment and send that back. And that's a little trickier. It requires a little bit more skill of your participants, so there's always some chance of not getting as much good feedback, but it's very cheap. The other way is there are many electronic survey companies. The university has access to SurveyMonkey, which is a really good way to get surveys. There's also Qualtrics. There's several companies that can will format your survey so that when you send the email, there'll just be a link, and when your respondent clicks on the link, the survey will come up and prompt them how to go through the whole thing. When you're done with the survey, you'll get a certain output format, and you'll have to be specific about how you want it. Sometimes when they give you the output format, they will actually give it to you in words. For example, strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, strongly agree, or agree, strongly agree. And you'll get the verbal words written out, which is a little, you'll have to do some transformations before you're able to import that into a data management, some sort of software. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about follow-ups and incentives. There are several things you can do to increase your survey rates, the rate of response. And the rate of response is calculated simply by the number of people who responded divided by the number of people who were asked to respond. One good way to get a good survey response is to give a pre-notification and to just briefly let people know that you are going to be mailing them a survey somehow. Another good way is to do a second mailing. If you ask for a response within 3 weeks and people don't do it, you can send out a second mail, and this can be done either by snail mail or by email. And it's a little bit expensive to do it by snail mail, but some of your costs can be tracked if you can figure out who's responded and only send a second mailing to the people who haven't responded. It's obviously no cost for email. Some people do send out third mailings, but the return rate on third mailings, it tends to be small. Another way is to call people and ask them to respond, and you can even ask them some questions over the phone. Another way to get follow-up is to promise people the results. We've done this survey on the experiences of bits of teachers, and we'll share these results with you if you will respond. Of course, that's more work for you. Make sure that you let people know what your expectations are in terms of the timing. Okay, usually 2 to 3 weeks is plenty. The research shows that you really don't get very much return rate after 3 weeks unless you do some sort of a second mailing. I guess this is a good time for return rates. So how do you know what's enough? What return rate is enough? There's a lot of variability in the research. Some will say 75% is really good. Some will say 50% is good. Some will say it doesn't matter what your return rate is. If you have a large enough target population, if you get 200 surveys back, your results can be very stable. I think the biggest concern with return rates is finding out who returned your survey. So for example, if you sent out a survey to parents at your school and the only people who returned the survey were people in the mid to upper range economic level, and students who were more from a poverty level did not return the surveys, that would be a concern because there would be some sort of systematic bias, and you really would need to go back and elicit some more responses from people in the lower economic range to feel confident that your survey was providing you with accurate results. Now, some people will give incentives for people to complete a survey, and there's pluses and minuses to the incentives. The pluses, you'll get a higher return rate. The minuses, sometimes you can spend a lot of money on these and you don't get a lot of returns. Sometimes I've even got a survey in the mail one time where they gave me a dollar bill, crisp new dollar bill. So that was certainly an incentive. The other kind of incentive that you see more and more are lotteries. And the reason for lotteries is if you're sending out a very large survey and you know, to send everybody $1 and you're sending out, let's say, 2,000 surveys, 2,000 letters, let's say, that would be really prohibitively expensive. But you could have a lottery for tickets to a ball game or an iPod or something of this sort, and it's an incentive to people, but it's not as expensive